We can talk about that later, but right now this hour is about you. So we're going to talk about. So we're joined this hour. I think we're live. Just want to give it a couple seconds to make sure we're on. Okay, we're joined this hour by Mike the poet, Mike Sonsken, who is in the city of Los Angeles, one of probably the most prolific ambassador of the city in terms of poetry. Just an incredible writer, an essayist, a journalist, poet, obviously, Mike the poet, a tour guide. I mean, the list goes on and on. This man's hat collection is extensive. We're really, 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 really honored to have you here this hour, Micah. Can you share a poem with us?
The riots were the week before my prom. A month and a half before graduation, Southern California was a time bomb. Race relations worn like Vietnam. My crew more like the United Nations. The riots were the week before my prom. SoCal needed mindfulness like Thich Nhat Hanh. Multicultural coalitions for communication. Southern California was a time bomb. Tired citizens needed a new song. All the broadcasts played nonstop frustration. The riots were the week before my prom. 3 months later, I moved out of my mom's. UCLA, my emancipation. Southern California was a time bomb. Poetry music made it more calm. Journal writing became my salvation. The riots were the week before my prom. Southern California was a time bomb.
Yeah. So in this poem, you mention, of course, LA Rebellion and all that. But you also mentioned, and I'd like to get into that, but you also mentioned your time at UCLA. Now, while you were at UCLA, you had a very prominent professor there, right? That's a huge influence on many people. And
absolutely.
Can you talk a little bit about the man, the myth, the legend, Mike Davis?
Mike Davis, man. Mike Davis is a generous guy, man. He had been a truck driver and a meat cutter, and he himself didn't even start his own undergraduate career until he was 30. And I had him my senior year, and I had already read a lot of his work by the time I actually had him. And he was the type of professor that didn't give you that many explicit directions on how to write. I mean, he did a little bit, but he mostly, over the last 20 years, Mike Davis has probably given me 100 books. In many ways, I model my own teaching practice after him. He gave me a lot of books. He had us over at his house a few times. We had some pizza with him. He would tell us about how he wrote his own articles. I remember one time he even shared an outline with me that he'd written for an article. And so a lot of what I learned from him was through osmosis, just seeing what he was doing and how he was doing it. And he talked a lot about his belief systems. And this activity that he had us once do, he asked students to write out their list, their layers of identity. So we all have so many different layers of identity, whether it be your family, whether it be your ethnicity, your nationality, your political views, but also, a son, a father, a grandfather, and, grandson, Dodger fan, soccer player, basketball player, poet, musician. And so he had us write out all of our layers of identity. And I remember a lot of what I learned about him was just thinking about yourself. And he taught us to kind of be in tune with what you believe in. And from understanding your own belief system, then at that point you can start to write essays or start to write poems. And I remember I showed him some of my first LA poems. It was about 97. And he told me to keep going. He was like, oh, these are cool, keep going. And as I said, he didn't really try to, he wasn't too didactic. He didn't try to tell us how to do it. He mostly encouraged you. And so I have a lot of gratitude to Mike Davis.
So the people that are watching this video come from a wide array of backgrounds. So for those unfamiliar with Mike Davis, can you talk a little bit about some of his seminal works and what is kind of the what does he write about?
Well, he writes. His first book was actually called Prisoners of the American Dream, and it was about the age of Ronald Reagan and the history of the working class in America. And that book is an underrated book. It was a really good book. His second book, City of Quartz, was his breakout book, and that came out in 1990. And in many ways, that predicted the LA riots 2 years before they happened. And then, when the riots happened, he ended up winning one of those MacArthur Genius Fellowships. And a lot of things happened in the mid 90s where everything Mike Davis was talking about in the late 80s, early 90s made him look like a prophet. And in many ways, he was. He did deserve that attention. But he brought, there was a great essay he wrote after the 92 riots called Who Killed Los Angeles? And he talked about how economic restructuring and how changes. He would always speak about how in the 1960s you could just graduate from high school and get a job in a factory and pay a mortgage and essentially send your kids to college. But nowadays you got to have a master's degree to work at Subway. So he basically was just about. Go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say those people are sandwich artistes, but go on.
Yeah. Well, he basically was just really good at breaking down. He even could have been economist. He could break down economics and a lot of the little details of politics that can sometimes be glazed over. And he would always show us why things were the way they were, and things like the gutting of the aerospace industry and the loss of manufacturing jobs, and how all of those factors contributed to whether it be unemployed youth or whether it be any kind of discontent to the malaise that was really late 80s, early 90s. And he would always show us that there was economic reasons which created these social cycles, and the reason, basically the underlying reasons of why things were the way they were.
Yeah. Well, what I really enjoy about the work of Mike Davis is that it's not just things aren't happening in space. They're not happening in like the working class on the moon. It's not this generalized concept. He always places it somewhere. Always places it in geographic, areas that can be identified and pointed at. And I think your work has a lot of reflection of that. You very much write about Los Angeles, but you write about, it's not this theoretical LA. It's LA with places, with street signs, with restaurants, with families, with individual people who did one thing or another. And so, can you speak a little bit to that? Like, there's a certain amount of research that goes into the poems you write. Can you speak to that?
You know what? You bring up a really great point. It's all about concrete details. It's all about concrete facts, like you said, street names, people's names, restaurant names. The restaurant that's been there for 70 years and owned by the same family for 3 generations. Pounding the pavement, doing the research, and I always believe, I love to read books, but even more than I love to read books, I spent my 20s and 30s just running around neighborhoods, just going places, going to neighborhoods, going to different venues. And that as a man who's been to a million open mics, but going to different bookstores, going to art galleries, going down to San Pedro and walking out on Point Furman, and going to Barnsdall Park and in Los Feliz, and just going places, Griffith Observatory, Elysian Park, Venice Boardwalk, Hollywood Boulevard, Leimert Park. And from going to these spaces, so much happens from traveling to those spaces, and you meet people. And for me, there's no substitute. Actually, it's funny. I was just talking to Doug Brown, and I've been home with my kids lately, and I need to just go take a drive. I'm not planning on getting out of the car. I'm cool with the social distance, but other than going to Ralph's, I haven't gone anywhere in the last month or so. And I'd like to get out, and I get a lot of energy from just driving around the city.
Yeah. So a lot of what you do is very connected to, it's done with an artistic flair, but a lot of it is very much oral history.
Yes, sir.
So how do you feel? So it's an interesting thing to do, because in a way, there's a lot of formal training, there's a lot of gatekeeping, there's a lot of whatever if you go through the traditional routes of academia, which you have as well. But long before, you were teaching at a collegiate level, you were speaking at universities, you were speaking before audiences, you were speaking at panels, you were speaking at these things. And it was kind of through the the door of art, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in a way, when you are making art, you can kind of sneak your own sociological take on things, or your
Mm-hmm.
own
Mm-hmm.
philosophical take on these things that you would usually have to get credentialed in order to speak on a panel. But as an artist, you kind of snuck in the back. You're able, not you, but
You know,
someone
that's
is
a
able.
really
Yeah.
that's a really great point, Matt. And I mean, that's in a lot of ways the model that Mike Davis followed, that Luis Rodriguez followed. It's about living your art, that there is no separation. And I just learned a really fancy academic term from a guy who was a graffiti artist. This is a dude named Stefano Block, and he just did this book called Going All City. And Stefano Block was also better known as Cisco from the
Okay.
graffiti crew CBS, and he was one of the best known graffiti writers of the 1990s. I originally met him from Mir One, but now Cisco, he recently got a PhD in geography, and he's now a professor in cultural geography. But long before, he'll be the first to tell you this, long before he got his PhD in cultural geography, Cisco probably knew the geography of LA better than damn near anybody. And he was a really prolific graffiti writer that got up all over the city. And so he actually taught me about this term recently called autoethnography. Now, ethnography is the study of people and places and doing the research. But when you're doing autoethnography, you're putting yourself within the story. And I was also talking about autoethnography with A.K. Tony, because A.K. Tony does a lot of autoethnography about Leimert Park, where he's been doing poetry for 28, 29 years. But I like the idea of autoethnography, and I'm gonna read a tiny bit out of Cisco's book because he put it really well about autoethnography. And my research methods and the presentation form of my work in this book follows an approach known as autoethnography. The qualifying prefix auto acknowledges the reflexive assertion and insertion of the self into the ethnographic accounting of and writing about others. More specific for my own work, and as geographer David Butts puts it, the autoethnographic sensibility evokes a knowledgeable perspective on the metropolis from the margins and provides an example of research and writing that is emotionally invested, experiential, and grounded in place, saturated with local specificity, the ebb and flow of daily life, and what's going on behind the scenes. While the ethnographer's personal experience and individual perspective have always played a role in the research process, any formal acknowledgement of this has traditionally been relegated to footnotes or given only brief mention in subsections. Autoethnography, which brought personal experience out of the margin notes, becomes a part of ethnographic research during the early stirrings of post-colonial and post-positivist approaches to research within anthropology, but started to come of age as part of the post-structuralist, postmodern feminist and cultural forms taking place within sociology, cultural geography, performance studies, communication studies, and women's studies. There's a lot more to it, but autoethnography, I love that idea. And so while I was writing about these neighborhoods, I had spent time in those neighborhoods. You know, I had a job in that neighborhood. I used to teach in the neighborhood, or I was teaching in the neighborhood, or my grandfather used to live in the neighborhood or something. So I really like this idea of autoethnography. And when Mike Davis was writing about LA, his new book is about LA in the 60s. Well, he was in the civil rights movement in the 60s. And Dorothy Healy, the head of the LA Communist Party, was one of his first members, was one of his first mentors. And Mike Davis told me about his best friend was a guy named Levi Kingston, who just passed. And Levi Kingston was the bridge between the Black Panthers, the Marxists, the Venice Beats, and he owned a coffee house called Pogo Swamp in LA in the early 60s. And so Mike Davis grew up running around LA with Levi Kingston in the 60s. And they were hanging out with the Black Panthers. They were at Marxist bookstores, but he was also driving a truck, and he was a meat cutter. And so so Cisco writes this really great book which might be one of the very best books ever about growing up in the San Fernando Valley, because he's talking about before North Hollywood was gentrified. He's talking about Pacoima and Sylmar, and he has a really powerful passage. I just wrote this article. It's probably going to come out in a week or two. I wrote an article that's going to come up on KCT about the Great Wall of Los Angeles, which Judy Baca's mural, which is a big influence on me. But Cisco used to live across the street from the Great Wall of Los Angeles in this little small apartment with his mom. And he talked about how before he'd gotten politicized, he would walk by the Great Wall of Los Angeles and see images of people from the Holocaust, images from people in Japanese internment camps, images of people in the Bracero program. And he said it would stir him up and it would touch him, but he didn't quite comprehend it yet because he was 16, 17, 18 years old. But a few years later, as he started studying history, a few years later, he decided he wanted to go to college. He went to junior college first, and then he transferred. And eventually, before you know it, by the time he's 30, he's getting a PhD in cultural geography. But Judy Baca's mural was really influential in his turning political. And so, but the idea of autoethnography is, Cisco knew LA geography because he ran around. And so I really believe in that. I got a buddy of mine who's an urban planner, and he wrote this essay called "You Cannot Plan from Your Desk." He's an urban planner. He says urban planners need to get out of their desk in City Hall. And if you're going to be an urban planner in South Central, get to know the people in the neighborhood.
Yeah. So, you did mention this autoethnography earlier. I mentioned oral history. This concept is coming to mind of testimonials, and it seems like there's all these different variants and strands, and they're all different from each other. I'm not going to say they're all the same, but they're all pushing towards the same thing, which is that we need to talk to people and listen to people and make that part of our understanding of what the world is and what the academy should be talking about or studying.
100%, Matt.
And your poetry is very much in line with that.
Thank you. Well, it really is about people's stories. There's been a lot of, it's funny, in the last couple of years, I've written some essays that talked about my methods, but I did my methods before I knew how to articulate it. But there was this influential woman urban planner named Dolores Hayden, who, by the way, is also a poet. And Dolores Hayden wrote this book called The Power of Place. And she talked a lot about this idea called people's history. And Howard Zinn, People's History of the United States, or Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, who I know you know. And so the idea of people's history, which is what Judith Baca was doing with the mural of the Great Wall of Los Angeles, was telling lesser known history. And but Dolores Hayden talked about in her book, she thought that the real history of LA was women and people of color, and that too long, she said there was an idea of Judy Baca called it the cannon in the park, an old white guy on a horse, a statue of John Wayne. You know what I mean? And your poems hit this a lot. The Cowboys and Indians theory of history. Yeah. But what about that woman who worked in the neighborhood for 50 years? That woman knows the history of Boyle Heights better than anybody.
Absolutely. I mean, and it's not a cool thing to say. It's not look at me and how like down I am or woke or hip or whatever. It's accurate. I mean, like, why would an academic sitting in their office all day understand better a street corner? Why would that's like not possible, right? So so that's definitely, and I definitely think that your writing, the writing that you do, really portrays. So I'm going to ask you actually a little bit, talk about methodology. And when we talk about methodology, we're really talking about the content. We're really talking about the kind of the stuff of your writing. But I'm going to mention your craft as well. What you end up doing oftentimes, I notice, is you have like a key phrase or refrain that you're going to return to a few times, and you're going to end up hooking a lot of information around it, right? So like, I'm alive in Los Angeles. LA was a time bomb, et cetera. So how do you go about your craft? How do you go about like, aha? I mean, I got this like line in my mind. It's like Los Angeles is our skyscrapers competing for clouds, and now I'm gonna put a bunch of information around it. Like, how do you pair these key phrases and a data set? How do you go about that?
That's a great question. My late teens and 20s, it all started from a lot of people watching. We would sit at UCLA. I'd sit on Bruin Walk with my notebook, or my buddy Phil and I. We used to drive all over the city. We used to hang out in little coffee houses in the 90s and did a lot of people watching and a lot of driving. but it was kind of my methodology for my poetry was always a combination of observation, people watching, and going places all over the city and seeing people, and even to the point of where I almost always used to carry a little notebook. And I mean, I still pretty often carry a notebook, but the poems were always kind of and this is the same thing with my journalism and essays too. It would be a combination of pounding the pavement, being running around the streets, things that you see, and then also reading a book. Like I might, while the time I'm studying a lot about murals, I read Judy Baca's book, and in her book she talked about that murals are a choreographed dance, and so sometimes the phrase might come from something I'm reading. I mean, sometimes it even comes from a piece of conversation I overheard. Sometimes it's just the spirit of the air, the zeitgeist of the moment. And so a combination of listening to people. I always like to go places and hear people's stories, do a lot of people watching, reading, and like there's more than two ways, but the two main ways of doing research for me are pounding the pavement, being out there in the real world, and then also reading. Like I do like to come back home and then later on read an essay or read about it, and so I would try to do the physical research first and then later on go back and look it up and double check.
Okay, so now we're gonna hop in our time machine, right? We're back in the late '90s, and you and Philharmonic are running around the city of Los Angeles. Exactly. Please tell our audience first who's Philharmonic, and then we'll get to this next part.
You know what? Philip Martin, aka Philharmonic. Without Philharmonic, without Philip Martin, there would be no Mike Sonsken, Mike the Poet. Phil is a legendary cat, man. He's a really mythical dude. He's now lives in Brooklyn. But Phil was a high school All-American soccer player and was born in Jamaica and moved to Dallas, Texas when he was 12. And in Dallas, Texas, he was an all-star soccer player. His father was a Jamaican soccer legend. Philharmonic is so legendary. His dad was buddies with Bob Marley. Phil is kind of mythical. He's a character. Wonderful dude. But he was a freshman at UCLA the same year I was a freshman, and we lived on the same floor of the dorms. And I remember when I was first starting to write poems, I had my little journal. We were in the underground hip hop scene, and we were going to a lot of events. And I was the only non-soccer player that Phil hung out with. But one day we,
you always said I'm the only. I think I had a certain expectation, and then I think the audience might have had a certain expectation. But then you said only a non-soccer player. That was
yeah. It was Phil was an interesting cat because he's also a painter, and he's very artistic and creative. But to this day, he is a soccer coach, a painter. He's a fantastic poet too. He's not doing as much poetry as he did before. He's mostly doing. His income is equally split between coaching soccer and his art. He and his wife are fine artists. But Phil was reading Baudelaire and Rimbaud. And we were reading Amiri Baraka. We were reading the Beats. But Phil was up on surrealism. He was up on Bob Kaufman. And he always had a lot of. So we would just read our poems in the dorm room or to our girlfriends or whatever. But then he was always like, man, let's go out. And so we would start. Eventually, by the time we're graduating from UCLA, 96, 97, we're starting to read poems at venues. But I mean, I'd say there was a couple of years where we were just doing poems at backyard parties. And we used to go to Venice Beach and rock poems at barbecues and drum circles. And people would be, somebody would be playing a bass or something, and we would just be jamming with them. And so, we'd read a lot of the Beats and the Black Arts Movement and the Harlem Renaissance. And we were trying to start our own, Renaissance. And so a lot of it was this movement. And we were really inspired by the history. I mean, we read the Beats, so we were kind of trying to be the 21st century Beats at the time.
Right. So late 90s have now become history, right? So tell us about some of the venues of that time.
There was this venue, the first venue that I really performed at regularly, and that's actually where I met Chiwon Choi from Writ Large Press, was a place called the House of Green. Believe it or not, it was at Westwood Brewing Company. But it was you remember this guy? You remember Ordell Cordova, John Kinney,
Of
aka
course, I remember DJ Naj. Of course.
aka
Everybody,
DJ,
let's,
aka DJ Naj. Well,
yeah.
Ordell had this venue that was equally poetry, singer-songwriters, hip-hop. There might even be a punk band or a heavy metal band, even a comedian. But the famous comedian Cat Williams performed there before he was really famous. The Living Legends, the underground hip-hop crew, some punk bands. There was this punk band called Dogwater. I mean, it was DJ Naj was a wonderful dude, man. And but he had this really eclectic open mic that Phil and I used to perform at all the time. And a few years later, we started doing stuff at the Onyx and Beyond Baroque. And there was a place in Los Feliz, Psychobabble. And we started, going to Lamert Park and going to different places. But the first place that we really performed at regularly was the House of Green, which was at Westwood Brewing Company. And there was also a spot in Culver City that was held in our buddy's basement. It was called Underwords. I mean, it was all really like very bohemian and underground. And that was the time.
That's a little before my time, but I mean, I've heard many a legend. So we've mentioned throughout. You've mentioned throughout. You're also a writer of articles and reviews. And what do you call it? Yeah, you write stuff.
Yes, sir.
Periodically. So you've written for KCT a little bit, and you're writing now. You have a column now at Cultural Weekly. Can you tell us a little bit about the work you were doing with KCT?
KCT is really where I found my voice because it's a perfect place to the pieces I'm writing have a spirit that can be scholarly and can be academic, but it's not pretentious. There's this idea I really like, this idea of public history, that history belongs to everybody. And even though people can accuse him of being Pollyanna, Huell Hauser, but if you think about Huell Hauser, he bridged a lot of gaps, and though he was very more on the sunny side of things, but Huell Hauser probably brought more people interested into California history, than even Kevin Starr and Mike Davis. And Mike Davis actually likes Huell Hauser. I mean, Huell Hauser doesn't have Mike Davis's critical analysis, but what I liked about KCT was that I could write something that was in the spirit of Mike Davis or Luis Rodriguez, but at the same time, I always hear my grandfather's voice in my head because my grandfather he never went to college. He worked on the Southern Pacific Railroad. My grandfather was a smart guy, but he grew up in the Great Depression. So, when he graduated high school, you got a job. You didn't go, but my grandfather was a guy who loved to read. But if somebody's using a few too many words, my grandfather would be, "Oh, this guy's full of it." You know what I mean? So like, I still hear my grandfather's head in my voice. I hear his voice in my head. And so what I like about KCT is that I can write about these things, but keep it in a level that's for everybody. And so KCT is a nice place for this middle ground. There's this idea of the public intellectual. I like the public intellectual idea more so than being a scholar is cool, but if you're too scholarly, you're only talking to the other scholars.
Yeah. For our audience, because again, this is a wide variety of people who will be viewing this and seeing this, coming from different places. Tell us a little about Huell Hauser.
Well, Huell Hauser was an interesting guy because he was originally from Tennessee, and he was a television broadcaster, and he came to LA in the early 80s and actually briefly worked on the show Entertainment Tonight, of all things, which was a complete opposite of who he was. But Huell Hauser fell in love with California history and started this show called California Gold. And KCT actually has over 2,000 episodes of California Gold. And Huell Hauser died in 2013. But when he finally passed, you can say whatever you want to say about Huell Hauser, but one thing about him was that he was a fan of everyone. He was a fan of the working man. Huell Hauser would go to that small restaurant. The thing that he had in common with Jonathan Gold was that he would go somewhere wherever Huell Hauser went, he would find the beauty in it, whether it be the Donut Man in Glendora, or whether it be some Korean barbecue or something. Now, Jonathan Gold might be able to tell you a little more specifically about the food. Huell Hauser would just be like, "This is amazing," you know what I mean. And Huell Hauser wasn't so intellectual about it, but his pure love of life and Huell Hauser was a part of people awakening to how beautiful California is. I mean, there's always the fun and the sun and the Gidget and the Beach Boys and Baywatch. But Huell Hauser was also like, let's go into these corners and go to this little mom and pop restaurant, and let's go out to Joshua Tree and Noah Purifoy's assemblage art and these beautiful pieces of art against the desert landscape. And so what I did, I wrote this in my book, but for about a 10-year period of my life, Huell Hauser was the only thing my dad and I could agree on. And Huell Hauser was about appreciating people. And so I like that spirit about him. And I think everybody deserves to be appreciated. Whether or not you agree with people, people do deserve to be appreciated.
Do you find that the Beach Boys represent fun in the sun? Because to me, so that's some of the most depressing music I've ever heard in my life. I mean, the melodies, God, the lyrics, Jesus.
You know what? In the beginning, they were fun and sun, but after Pet Sounds and after the late '60s, and also people always talk about how they were one of the biggest bands in the world, and then the Beatles just took them out. The dark, Beach Boys, Charles Manson wrote a song for the Beach Boys, and he was actually looking for them the night that he killed Sharon Tate. He was looking. They were looking for the Sharon Tate was in a mansion that had formerly been owned by one of the Beach Boys.
Yeah. So another artistic mind who likes to collect a lot of L.A. L.A. The stuff of Los Angeles and history and kind of play around with it would be Quentin Tarantino. So what did you make of some of these controversies that came out of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, like the portrayal of Bruce Lee and all that? And what's your opinion on that?
The portrayal of Bruce Lee was bad. That was terrible. I wish they would have left that out, because Bruce Lee is sacred. You can't really diss Bruce Lee, man. Bruce Lee is sacred, and they should have left that out. I know Tarantino likes to do his sensationalist thing.
Yeah.
But on another note, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood did capture a certain spirit of the late '60s in LA, and some of the footage, if you just want to talk about the vintage quality of it, the footage was cool. Do you know what I mean? And the music and everything. But the Bruce Lee, I could have done without the Bruce Lee section.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the rest of it was pretty cool. I mean, it's kind of like a Western set in LA, right? It had the beats of a Western, right? Like, like the society's passing the old gunslinger by, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then a big shootout at the end with this threat to the community, right? So
you know what? The reversal was cool. Like, I didn't expect the reversal that happened was the ending. I was not something I was prepared for. And that was kind of hilarious. That was kind of hilarious.
Yeah. Well, the Westerns always end with like Shane's riding out. He saved the city, but there's no place for him anymore. The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, same thing. There's always like this thing where like somebody has to do something, and now what they've done makes them so monstrous that there's no place in them in a civilized society, right? And so they have to leave, right? So this is kind of typical Western stuff. So it's kind of funny to me that Brad Pitt, who is our Shane, I guess, has to leave, but he leaves like in a hospital bed like this. That's kind of funny. I don't know. That's kind of funny to me.
It was. Hey, you know what? I mean, Tarantino. When Pulp Fiction came out, it was my third year at UCLA, and I think about Reservoir Dogs and even True Romance. I mean, Tarantino isn't perfect, but his early work did reflect a certain spirit of the 1990s, and did capture a side of LA that was, you could tell he was a native.
Yeah, almost all stuff's in it. I mean, he's not perfect and whatever, but neither is Scorsese. I mean, like all these people like make about New York. That's all. It's weird. Like people talk about Tarantino, but they erase the LA part. Like they make the LA thing. I mean, critics, right? They make the LA thing insignificant. I think that is actually telling of a larger issue. Like when people write, like when great writers emerge from Los Angeles, they're treated as though they're like greatness on the moon. Again, like it's not geographically placed. So there's just something about the fact that the American consciousness refuses to. They know that this thing called LA exists, but they refuse to accept its the size, scope, and the the size of its fingerprint on the nation as a whole. Do you
Yeah,
find
that's a good point, bro. I mean, America is still very East Coast centric. Everything is still really New York based, and probably always will be to a certain extent. But a lot of cultural critics will say that in a lot of ways, a lot of cultures have started out west and go east. I mean, at least if you think about in the '60s, San Francisco and the Summer of Love and the LA Cool, like so. In some ways, even hip hop, when gangsta hip hop, I mean, there was Schoolie D was a Philadelphia hip hop artist, and so gangsta rap isn't exclusive to L.A. And there was Too Short and there was Oakland, but there are a lot of things that do start in L.A. that make their way east, and I mean, obviously there's things that start in New York and make their way west too. But
yeah, no, I don't mean just New York or Chicago for that matter, but I would take note of this. Luis Rodriguez writing about the San Gabriel Valley and parts of the East Side. He doesn't get that book published until he has like Chicago, until he's in Chicago. You know what I mean? And near the Chicago chain that's close, that's tied to the New York chain. Luis Urrea writing about the borderlands where he doesn't, and he's from San Diego, but he doesn't get access to those things until he moves to Chicago. So for whatever reason, we here in Los Angeles, even when talking about Los Angeles, we have to leave Los Angeles if we want to have like a national voice, even when writing about the city we're from. It's a really bizarre phenomenon.
That's a really great point, and it's funny because my own dad used to say this to me in the late '90s. Nobody cares about LA history, and this is when I was first getting into it. I mean, this is when I was first starting to write about it. And it's funny because my dad is almost the same age as Mike Davis, and he probably damn near knows as much as Mike Davis, but he grew up in the middle of all that, and he took it for granted, and it didn't really mean anything to him. And so Luis, when he talks about Always Running was published just after the '92 uprisings, and so people were ready to start hearing alternative histories and alternative stories. And Luis was perfectly placed because he had lived it. And Luis was coming, in many ways, his work is also in that autoethnographic spirit of a memoir of a man that really knew what he was talking about and that had lived it. And the authenticity of Luis Rodriguez's voice is what really further helped that work get out there. But people, maybe if the '92 uprisings hadn't, '92 rebellion hadn't happened, maybe Always Running, people were ready for Always Running when it came out.
Yeah, no, definitely. No, and I mean, it was obviously a huge success, and Luis has been a huge success, and all well deserved. It's a note that I noticed, like Luis, also Urea, also the list goes on. I mean, everyone has to like somehow leave LA to talk about LA because there's no, if you're not going to have a national voice unless you're connected to that machinery out there. So it would seem to me. I'm not gonna. I don't know, but I wanted to talk a little bit about a recent article that you produced, that you wrote for Cultural Weekly, or a recent periodical. You're commemorating the life of Lewis McAdams. Can you tell our audience a little bit about who this man was?
Lewis McAdams is another man that definitely. You can even say comes out of that sort of autoethnographic spirit too. Lewis McAdams was a poet and was even in the late '60s pretty close with the New York School of Poets, Ted Berrigan and Creeley and Charles Olson. But in the early 1970s, 10 years before Lewis McAdams even came to LA, he was up in the Bay Area and he was in a city called Bolinas. And have you ever heard about Bolinas at all?
No, don't.
Bolinas is an interesting place because by the way the crow flies, it's like 15, 20 miles north of San Francisco, but it's in this really inaccessible part of Marin County. And the Bolinas residents don't want people to come there. So they'll even pull the sign off PCH, that leads the road there. But
Yeah,
Bolinas was full of hippies in the 60s and 70s,
yeah,
and it was very environmentalists and people into deep ecology and everything. And so a lot of poets that were from the commune scene and that were very bohemian lived in Bolinas in the early 70s. And Lewis McAdams was one of them. And there was an oil spill off the California coast. This is a story that Lewis McAdams always talked about. And that oil spill was a really major moment in his life. And he and a few hundred people in Bolinas ended up taking direct action and trying their best to clean up the beach. And he always tells the story. He's written about it extensively, but that really politicized him and got him interested in environmentalism. And during the 70s, he was living in Bolinas, but he was also doing a lot of poetry at the San Francisco Poetry Center at Cal State San Francisco, at San Francisco State. And in 1980, Lewis McAdams moves to LA, and he's a part of the punk rock and performance art scene. And it's funny, in the 80s, a lot of people used to call spoken word performance art because people like Rollins, people were doing poetry with punk bands, and the band X, the lead singer Exene Cervenka, but Wanda Coleman was down with all of them, and Lewis McAdams was down in the Arts District. And by the way, the Arts District is really just East Little Tokyo. The Arts District was something that was invented in the 80s. It was really just in between, the LA River is what's in between Little Tokyo and Boyle Heights. But the neighborhood that's the Arts District now with all those condos, at one point in time, it was just the eastern section of Little Tokyo, and there was a lot of warehouses. And there started to be a lot of, as those warehouses started to get vacant, there started to be a lot of art events. And so Lewis McAdams was doing these art events and doing poetry in warehouses in the Arts District in the early 1980s. And one day he's behind one of these warehouses and there's a fence, and he looks at the fence and sees this concrete channel, and he's like, "What's that?" And somebody tells him, "Oh, that's the LA River." He's like, "The LA River? What?" And then so he's become politicized in Bolinas 5, 10, 15 years before that. So he starts doing all this research on the LA River and finds out that it used to be a natural waterway and that it was 52 miles long, and that in 1938 there was a flood that killed 83 people, and how most of the poor neighborhoods in LA were usually along the river. And so as he starts uncovering these things and uncovering that most of Southern California was wetlands prior to the freeways being built, prior to the shopping malls, and at one point in time, Southern California was all wetlands, marshlands, and willow thickets. And, Beverly Hills, La Cienega, the swamp. La Cienega is the swamp. Beverly Hills was a swampland. A lot of LA was marshlands. And so he starts doing all this research and finds out how when the Spanish in 1781 built LA, they built LA where the Arroyo Seco, which is a tributary of the LA River, where the Arroyo Seco and the LA River meet. It's a place called the Confluence, and it's just right underneath Dodger Stadium, basically where the 5 and the 110 meet is where the Confluence is. That's where the 44 Spanish pobladores built LA. And there was the Native American village Yangna, and all of that was right there. But the whole history of LA came out of this history of the city, of the river, and this river that most people that lived in LA didn't even know existed. And so as he started becoming educated on the history of the river, he wanted to restore the river. And so the first night that they started the Friends of the LA River, there's this famous story where they talk about that they had bolt cutters and they cut the fence and they went back to the river. They went to the river and they asked the river if they could speak for the river, and he said they didn't hear no. So they started the Friends of the LA River. But the first night they started the Friends of the LA River, he was doing he called it a 40-year performance art piece. And the first night that they declared the start of the Friends of the LA River, he dressed up in a totem of all these different species that had been on the river. At one point in time, grizzly bears used to eat steelhead out of the LA River. There used to be grizzly bears in Southern California. The last grizzly bear was killed around, I think, 1908 or something, around Camp Pendleton. But grizzly bears were indigenous to Southern California. But in any event, Lewis McAdams did a poetry performance, and it was 85, 86. And he dressed up in a totem of all the species on the LA River. and a critic from the LA Times was there, and what the performance that he did was so far out. The critic of the LA Times wrote an article, with friends like Lewis McAdams, the LA River doesn't need any enemies, and and totally dissing him,
Right.
but the thing was 5, 10, 15 years later, the Friends of the LA River had several thousand members, and now, they've been around now 35 years, but they've restored they've turned a lot of areas into pocket parks, and they've made a significant amount of progress on the LA River. I mean, there's obviously much, much more work to be done, but the Friends of the LA River started with poetry, and Lewis had a lot of poems about the LA River. He wrote a 75-page poem called The River, which was modeled after William Carlos Williams Patterson. And Lewis, he said, it's funny because he talks about how, the last 30, 35 years, he's been more into politics and was more of a lobbyist and was trying to change public policy. But he started off as a very bohemian poet.
Any one of these stories could lead to follow-up questions and entire conversations for hours upon hours. But I want to touch on a name you mentioned here, and maybe for our audience, again, wide variety of people, maybe they haven't heard. Can you tell us a little about Wanda Coleman and who she was and what she means to LA poetry?
Wanda Coleman, I have some sacred giants that have really influenced me. We've spoke about Luis Rodriguez. We spoke about Mike Davis. We spoke about Lewis McAdams. Wanda Coleman too. This is a new book of her poems that just came out. Actually, it's a selected poems, and the great Terrence Hayes edited it. And right. Wanda wrote close to 20 books, and for my. Charles Bukowski is the most famous poet to ever come out of LA. But if you ask me, Wanda is probably the second most famous, but also Wanda is even a little bit more complicated. Wanda, she had done some time with the Watts Writers Workshop, but she told me she was never really an official member of the Watts Writers Workshop. They were more, it was almost exclusively men. She said it was more of a boys' club, but Wanda grew up in Watts, went to Fremont High School, and really was a very prolific LA poet. And she never graduated from Cal State LA either. It's funny. Octavia Butler went to Cal State LA. A lot of heavy people came out of Cal State LA, but Wanda Coleman had a child, late 60s, and she never finished her degree, but she published 20 plus books and a lot of poetry. I think 18 books of poetry and a novel and a book of short stories. I think I might have missed one or something, but Wanda was an incredible poet, a really good performer. Somebody once told me that a lot of the young slam poets were imitating somebody who was imitating somebody who was imitating somebody who was imitating Wanda Coleman.
I like that. That's what we're supposed to do, right? We're supposed to We're supposed to imitate things we don't even know we're imitating, right? That's as human beings. That's part of the oral tradition.
My buddy Doug Brown loves this story, but the first time I met Wanda Coleman, I did my poem LA Authors, and she says to me, after I met her, and I'd already been reading her for 7-8 years when I met her. It was 2001, 2002. It was at Beyond Baroque, and she says to me, a literary rapper.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. So again, for those who are watching this from different parts of the country, Cal State LA is a school that has produced a lot of genius, as Mike is referring to. We had a physicist on talking about Cal State LA, and again, Cal State LA is a place in my own heart because my mom went to Cal State LA, my aunt went to Cal State LA, 2 of my cousins went to Cal State LA. I was born about 2 miles from Cal State LA. I was baptized about 1.5 miles from Cal State LA. My aunt used to manage the McDonald's that's right off right by the 710, right near Cal State LA. So that's a place.
Eastern. Yeah.
On my dad's side, my aunt, she used to manage that one. The one with the little the automatron burger drive-thru. Yeah. So I got a lot of history with that. I got a lot of history with that place. So, I wanted to talk. It's so fascinating, Mike. I really wanted to take this hour to really highlight your work, but we just ended up talking about other people, which is again a testament to your spirit, to who you are, and because it wasn't forced, it happened kind of naturally. But I do want to get to you. I want to get to you and your books and what you got coming, what you got. What's on the horizon?
Well, it's always a lot. So much of my work has been about writing about the literary history of LA, and also, for that matter, the culture, and been plenty of my writing about music and art. And I mean, like behind me, this is a piece by Mir One, and Mir One had done my first book cover for my "I'm Alive in Los Angeles" book. But I love the literary history, and so in my book, "Letters to My City," it's a mixture of essays and poems. And there's a poem about Wanda Coleman in there. There's actually a poem for Luis Rodriguez in there. I've been writing a series on the history of literary LA, and right now I'm working on a book of essays about the literary history of LA, and putting together another book of poems. And a lot of times, I just write, and I try to produce as much work as I can, and then along the way, I find some themes or some through lines, and it all kind of starts to come together. But I really do believe in the spirit of doing the action and doing the work. And as you do the work and you work hard, things begin to fall into place. Sometimes I've planned things out, but sometimes I've just worked really hard. And the harder you work, things have a way of kind of working themselves out. So
Yeah.
That's really been the spirit.
So for many years, you carried this mantle, the hardest working poet in Los Angeles. Tell us about that.
You know what? There was a lot of times where we were running around open mics, and it was a lot of fun. Also, my wife at the time, our first few years together, my wife was a flight attendant, and so my wife would be out of town for 1 or 2 weeks at a time. And so during that time, my buddy Phil and I would go out and perform 3-4 nights a week, and we'd go out and you've done this yourself. You go sometimes do 2-3 performances in one night. And also, as I said, we've been reading a lot of Ginsberg and Kerouac and Gregory Corso, and so that spirit of being out in the city was something that was a major inspiration for me. So I loved running around town and going to different places.
Yeah. Well, Mike, you were a major inspiration for me, and that is the reason why I did a lot of what I did the way I did it. You kind of provided a template, a model, a way to go about things, which it wasn't a secret. Work hard, meet people, make connections.
Yeah, one thing leads to another, right?
Yeah. But I really appreciate it, Mike. I really do. I really appreciate you spending this hour with us. We're going to drop some links below. Just message me and we'll put them below so people can follow up, find your books, find your work, and find anything else that you want to promote and anything else that you think people should know about from this conversation that we had here today. Thanks, Mike. I really appreciate it. And I'm sure we'll be seeing you.
Thank you, Matt. And I want to say these last 8 lines. Build the bridge, lay down the bricks, fill in the ridges, stack the sticks, feed the fire, consider the cost, take it up high, the city is ours. LA. Thank you, Matt.